Okay, guys, I was hoping that I would not have to make this video, but unfortunately, Closed Heaven has been confirmed officially by Konami, and it is coming in info. So I wanted to make a video on where I think Whitewoods can fit into the upcoming meta, and briefly go over what your options are for building Whitewoods. Also, I would like to briefly use as context another tier list. Every single Yugi tuber on YouTube is going to be uploading their tier list predictions and all that. So I'm not going to waste your time and make another one. Pat claims to have playtested a lot of these decks, and I think he's generally a trustworthy player. So I'm going to use this as context to talk about where I think Whitewoods fits in here, and whether I agree with his choices and all that type of stuff. So first of all, if you do not know what this card does, it requires two effect monsters, okay? So this is generic. And it says you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls this card points to, semicolon. So that is the card activation procedure. Targeting is not technically a cost. This turn, if you link summon a link 5 monster using this card you control, you can also use that monster your opponent controls as material. And you can only use this effect once per turn, so it's a hard once per turn. Now that doesn't matter. What matters is that this is a light fiend, okay? Now, probably everyone watching this video, or most of you, already know about the Fiend Smith engine. Some of you may not be following the OCG meta, so let me just tell you that this engine is present in virtually every single deck that exists in the entire OCG. Like if you look at the Road of the King reports and you look at their metagame breakdowns of like big tournaments, the only deck that isn't playing this is Tenpai. And I would argue that Tenpai actually could play it. It's just that it deviates from their game plan of like a going second OTK strategy. So this is currently the best engine in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! In the OCG. And it is debatably the best engine that has ever existed in the entire history of Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of being like a sub-engine that any deck can play, like being a generic engine that you can put in any deck. And the reason that Closed Heaven is relevant is because the Link 1 requires a light fiend monster. Now, I'm not going to go over the basic combos for this because probably most of you already know it, but you can get to a card that can negate. So there's like a negation effect card. You can get to Beatrice. You can get to Appaloosa. You can also, like if you're going second, have some pops, and it's extremely easy to access. And some decks can access this much more easily than other decks. One of the best ones is probably Snake Eyes, because for them, putting bodies up is not very difficult. So, you know, you can just put 2 bodies, turn them into Closed Heaven, make Requiem, and then you can go into your Fiend Smith combo. It's very easy to do. And the reason that Closed Heaven is a big deal, even though these cards are already coming out in info, is this card, okay, which is now called Fiend Smith Engraver. This is the good card of the engine. So you probably have seen that everyone is playing Tractus, but you don't actually want to draw the Tractus. You want to draw this card, and you want to get Tractus through this card, and then you get Fabled Lurie, and you go into your combo. Some OCG lists that are playing a large package, where they're actually going to 3 Tractus, are also playing Sanctus. And basically, the reason for playing Sanctus is it's not a very good draw, but if you draw Tractus and not Engraver, the Fiend Smith Engraver, you need another card to give you a body on field. And so people are playing this because it generates a token that you can turn into like a Link monster or whatever, okay? So Closed Sky is a very, very big deal because you do not need to draw any of these cards. You don't have to worry about like playing this brick. You don't have to worry about how many copies of Tractus are you going to play. You can simply make Closed Sky with any 2 effect monsters and go into your Fiend Smith combo. Okay, so that aside, there are a couple decks that are benefiting the most from this. So there's probably Snake Eye. And Pack has here Yubel Fiend Smith, and he also claims Unchained. But just in terms of what are the actual best decks, it's going to be Snake Eye and Yubel that are playing Fiend Smith to like the absolute maximum potential. There are other decks that can do extremely interesting things with this, like the Chimera cards, and that's because there are interactions with parts of the engine. Like you can fusion summon Berfamit with Fiend Smith plays. Now you can throw the engine in most decks, but what's optimal is completely different. So these decks are going to remain the best decks. Okay, so let's talk about Whitewoods a little bit, and let me first just go over some of my ideas of the Whitewoods decks that you can play. I think there are only a couple rail versions of this deck right now. Maybe some things will be discovered in info as people playtest more, and when we see the like actual tops and stuff from major events, we will get some better ideas on like what is consistent and so on. There is a pure-ish version, which where you have to play the toy cards, and you can choose between playing power spells. You don't need to play prosperity. I'm just showing one sample build. You can play power spells. You can play skill drain with or without power spells. And I think that you should be maxing out on the toy engine, including 3 toy soldier. There's some discussion over like how good breakers are going to be if your opponent could be playing gimmick puppet and then you get FTK'd, or if your opponent is playing like a Centurion or Centurion Whitewood deck and you get Calamity'd or whatever. But leaving that discussion aside, you can also play the like a version that has more hand traps. You do not need to play skill drain. I just have that in here right now. And this is better against those types of decks, but it's very, very hard to beat decks like Snake Eye, especially with Fiend Smith, because they have so much gas that they can play through many, many different hand traps. So can Yubo. Unchained is also pretty good at playing through hand traps historically and gets better because they can play the Fiend Smith cards. So we're going to have to see like how good breakers are going to be versus hand traps. It is maybe very quickly worth mentioning that Thrust, I think, is particularly good because even if your opponent does not control a monster, if you set the legend and then you send it off another card and it sets itself back, you can then use it after that. And you can also gain access to your trap, which you can do the same thing with. And obviously it's a trap, so you're going to be using it in your opponent's turn anyhow. There's also a Runic version. I am not convinced by this. Quick little tech. This is not good, by the way. This is not good. I'm not saying that you should play this. But one of the main problems that the Runic version has is that you don't have a lot of ways to clear your opponent's board. And because you don't have a battle phase, this is kind of a big deal. So there is a combo that you can play where, because especially with the toy engine, you can very easily make rank 4s. You can make Springen's Merrymaker, and then you can overlay Sargus on top of Merrymaker. And this card can add a Springen's or Therian card from your deck to your hand. So you can add Tally-Ho Springen's, which can special summon Captain Sargus from your deck. And this can detach a material from an XYZ monster you control, then target a face-up card on the field, destroy it. Sargus also has an effect where if material is detached from monsters on the field, except during the damage step, you can target a card on the field, destroy it. So these give you some ways to get like some kind of board clear, which I have been testing, but like these cards are bricks, so you don't want to draw them. This is not very good. I think if you're playing the Runic version, you just need to accept the fact that you're playing a Runic deck, and there are going to be restrictions to that, and I don't know. Like, you probably will have to rely a lot on making like Chaos Angel in your own turn and stuff like that, so yeah, I don't know. I feel like either a hand trap version or a power spell version will be better. And then there's the Centurion version where you can play a small package. So one of my suggestions so that you can max out on the toy cards is that you just play Stand Up, Trudea, Primera, and Gargoyle. And I have also showed it in a previous video that you can play some of the better Centurion cards where Oath is the best one. And you could play more Stand Up because it's the second best card. But at this point, you are basically committing to playing breakers because you don't have enough space to play any number of hand traps that actually matter. Okay, so now that we've gone over some of the basic versions of the deck, let's go and look at the tier list here real quick and talk about where this belongs. If people go onto board breakers, the Centurion version, either version, but probably the smaller Centurion package version will probably end up being the best version of Whitewoods that exists because you will be able to Calamity lock your opponent, and breakers don't really stop that play. So that's a pretty robust strategy against people who are on breakers. In terms of being able to compete with other decks, one of the main limitations of Whitewoods is that it doesn't have like particular synergy with the Fiend Smith cards. You could play the Fiend Smith cards. Obviously, you would have to be on breakers, and you probably can't play the Centurion cards because you're not going to have a lot of space. And you have to stay at 40, in my opinion, on Whitewoods because I might make another video on like ratios and why math matters for deck building. But in decks where you have to draw combinations of cards and not just one card starter extenders like Snake Eyes, staying at 40 is an extremely big deal for drawing the combinations of cards like Toy Box or Soldier, and then a Whitewoods card that will interact with your Toy Box engine. And even going just a few cards above 40 starts to make that math look a lot worse. So you kind of have to play at 40. So playing the Fiend Smith cards in the Whitewoods deck will reduce greatly the amount of engine and non-engine that you can play in that deck. And you could say, like, maybe you make Beatrice with the Fiend Smith cards and you're checking for, hand traps with Beatrice. And if they hand trap you, then maybe you can use the rest of your engine to continue playing. And if they don't hand trap you, maybe you dump, so like, let me show you real quick. If I go into like a random deck and we look at Diabell, so this card says if this card is synchro summoned using a tuner synchro monsters material, so this is part of the normal ladder where you're using like Asteria and one of the 6s to go into Diabell, you can target a spell or trap in your graveyard, add it to your hand. So you could, for example, dump the Toy Box off of Beatrice, and then when you make Diabell, you can add back the Toy Box. But the problem with this is that this is not nearly as good as how Snake Eyes makes use of the Fiend Smith engine, where Beatrice can start the entire engine by itself, because you can have like the Link 2 and Beatrice, you can dump Snake Eye Ash, and then you can turn the Link 2 and Beatrice into Princess, special summon the Ash, and go full combo without having drawn a single Snake Eyes card. Whereas this way, if you're making the Beatrice and dumping the Toy Box, you still have to have a way to already play. Like, you have to have already had access to your Whitewoods engine and go all the way like laddering into Diabell to get back the Toy Box card. And then it's like, if you're going to get nibbed or something, or they're going to hit you with whatever, they probably would have done it already. So I'm not saying that you cannot play the cards in this deck, but the synergy is just not there. And I think you probably don't play those cards in this deck. But we'll see. I don't know. It could be that, it's a level 6 and maybe like you make Chaos Angel easier, and I don't know. But I'm not sure that it's super good right now. So I think that, being realistic, Whitewoods is probably going to lose to Fiend Smith Snake Eyes, generally speaking. And if you are on a hand trap build, I think Yubel Fiend Smith is going to play through all of your stuff, and you're not going to be able to beat their interruptions if they go first. I have seen like some use in playing breakers against this deck, and I think that you have to play this card possibly, because you can go into 10s, and this is a generic 10. So for some of you guys, if you played Tenpai, you may be familiar with this card, but this says, can't be destroyed by battle or card effects. You take no battle damage from attacks involving this card. At the end of the damage step, if this card that was special summoned from the extra deck battled, you can activate this effect. Banish all monsters your opponent controls. Also, for the rest of this turn, have the battle damage your opponent takes. Once per turn during the end phase, okay, so this is important, during the end phase, if this effect was activated this turn, so this is an activated effect. This is not like Mirror Jade, where you activate it at the time and then it applies later. Special summon as many monsters as possible you banish for this card's effect to your opponent's field. So once you banish all monsters your opponent controls, as long as you get rid of this card, they will not get those cards back. So Whitewoods can definitely play this card against Yubel. I actually find the matchup to be quite difficult, and so this may even be worth main decking if you think that your locals is going to have Yubel players. Or if you're going to like a larger event, you should probably expect that there will be a lot of Yubel players. So you probably have to main this card if you're going to a larger event. So yeah, but it is like beatable, I guess. Tenpai is kind of a weird matchup because if they don't have access to summoning, then it is extremely easy for the Whitewoods, just the basic Whitewoods cards, to interact with that engine. Like, just making Silvera multiple times stops them from like link summoning or synchro summoning or whatever. So, that's fine. I did try playing cards like Wonder Magician. So this card, does not get its effect to target a spell or trap on the field and destroy it because it's not synchro summoned off of Diabel. Because this one says when your opponent activates a card or effect, you can send a spell or trap from your hand or field to the graveyard. Special summon, not synchro summon. A level 7 or lower tuner synchro monster from wherever. So this doesn't get to pop on summon, but if you use this in combination with a level 2 on the field to make Kui Belt, then this one says if this card is synchro summon, you can target a card on the field and destroy it. And this gives you a very roundabout way of popping the Sangan summoning, which is the only thing that stops you from beating Tenpai very easily, in my experience. But it's like awkward because you have to make Wonder Magician and then have the level 2, like guaranteed have the level 2 to synchro into Kui Belt. So it's not ideal. But if you are able to do that, and then you can Book of Moon after that, your resource game is going to easily outpace their entire deck. So I don't think that the Tenpai matchup is like super hard per se, but I don't know how worth it is to take 2 cards of your extra deck and play them, especially if you're going to be on like a Centurion version of the deck, where you have to play like Auxilla, and then you're for sure on a Crimson Dragon package. So yeah. For the rest of these decks, obviously, like if they're not on the top tier, it's going to be easier to deal with. But in terms of like how you interact with them in particular, Branded is kind of weird because if you're on Breakers, you're going to lose to the Puppet Lock. Unchained doesn't really get hurt that bad by you booking their monsters, aside from the fact that they can't immediately link with them. But if they're Unchained monsters, they can still pop them and then resolve the effects. Melodious, I think, is still quite strong, but being able to book their monsters, I think, is generally good. So they can't link summon, but they have ways to fusion, so I think it's kind of iffy. I, right now, would probably say that if you go to a larger event and you're on Centurion Whitewoods, you could probably go quite far if you win a lot of dice rolls, because then the pressure is off of you to, like win the first game and be able to have at least a game 3 where you're going first if you lose game 2. So I would probably agree that Centurion Whitewoods is probably like it's a little bit more helmet. Like it's a little bit easier to rely on just those cards working. Whereas the pure Centurion deck is just not very good because it has to play like a ton of different bricks. Like the ratio of good cards to draw versus bad cards is not very good. But all of these fusion decks, they don't lose to just booking their monsters. Like if you like Chimera and Branded, like so the Book of Moon monster is like not super good against it. I think often what ends up happening in matchups like that, if I don't want to risk just losing to they hard drew like the Chimera fusion or whatever, is instead of making Silvera on their turn, I might make Arciela and then search an additional Veiler and just continue hand trapping them. And then, if they're on Breakers and they talents to take, it's not really that big of a deal that they've taken this card. Like, they can't really do much with this card. Aside from the fact that it's a level 6, so they can make Beatrice if those decks make Beatrice. But yeah, I think the Runic version is just like risky because the win condition isn't super solid when you don't have a way for the Runic engine to pop their cards. And I think maybe right now having a small Centurion engine so that you can play a ton of non-engine may be the best way to play this deck, because you don't want to have to cut down on your toy engine, because that is really like the heart and soul of the deck, that in terms of card advantage and card economy. In terms of the strategies that I was suggesting that you play before, like I have been a very big proponent of Gallant Granite, because you can very easily access rank 4s, and you can put Nib into your hand. Even if you're on Breakers, you can play 1 Nib, 1 Veiler, and I think that is a good idea, because in your standard combo, Arciela can search the Veiler and Granite can search the Nib, and then you can't lose to Breakers because you have like 2 very strong interruptions in your hand, and you can hopefully cycle through your engine. So yeah, we're gonna have to wait and see like what decks are bubbling to the top of these ones to see what we have to prepare most for. But if there's no FTK in the format, and maybe not a lot of other people are on Centurion cards, I would probably play a Breakers version of this. Let's see. Something, maybe not with this card. I don't think this card is very good, but maybe you play Rota for additional consistency, and maybe you're on a bunch of these cards. And you consider playing the Vorp Gate. I don't really want to take this card out against certain matchups. Like if you're playing a deck that makes Dragoon, for example, it can be kind of awkward to try to out that. There are some ways to do it where you could like run into it or whatever, but yeah, this card seems quite solid. Baguska seems like very safe, but you don't make it very often. Rafflesia, I think, is still quite good if Nib becomes good, because then you can play Gravedigger's Trap Hole for the Nib. And then whether you make Gallant or Rafflesia, you could still have the option of turning those into Little Knight, so I think you should probably play this card. And as I've shown before, the Appaloosa is important for going into 5th Summon Appaloosa, which is probably going to be good if people are on hand traps, but we'll just have to wait and see. So that's my general take on the position of the deck right now. I think it's definitely good enough to top for sure, like no question about it, and it is by far better than all of these decks down here. I think that it is probably better than all of these decks that he's placed in this tier, and I think if we figure out what the best version is, if that really is a small package of Centurion and Whitewoods, or just like Whitewoods Power Spell, I think it is probably going to be one of those two. I think that would probably be in this tier, so I would probably place it one tier above, but let's wait and see.